Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this Joseph Rowntree Foundation webinar to mark the start of Challenge Poverty Week in Scotland. I'm Jim McCormick, Associate Director with the GRF here in Scotland. I'm delighted you're able to join us. This morning, we've published our independent State of the Nation Monitor, Poverty in Scotland 2020, and we'll be talking a little bit about what we found in that report. The report shows the forces that have been driving poverty in Scotland before and during the pandemic. And this year's report is a little different from previous years in that it's very much a co-production, not just with our fantastic analysts at GRF gathering the facts, but also with a small group of people from across the country who have had first-hand experience of what it is to live on a low income. They've been telling us about what's happening behind the statistics, the real life stories affecting people's lives on an as it happens basis, and also helping us to shape the policy directions that we need to follow in Scotland if we are to get through the economic storm that is here with us already and maybe about to get much worse. So this morning, you can tweet using the hashtag Challenge Poverty and follow our partners at Poverty Alliance who are hosting Challenge Poverty Week throughout this week. And there's also a chance for you to post your questions using the Q&A function on the Zoom screen that you'll see. You'll be able to post your questions there at any point, but we will take them at key points in the event this morning. You can also use the upvote function if you spot questions you're particularly keen that we ask, and we'll try and get through as many of those as we can. So a quick word about why we're here this morning. We know that before the pandemic and all it has unleashed, about 1 million Scots of all ages were already in poverty. And if we think about the country's ambitious child poverty targets, then at best we were treading water on achieving them before the pandemic. We have seen bold and compassionate action from the Scottish Government and the UK Government with the furlough scheme, with the increases in housing and social security support over that period, and a raft of support for business, the third sector and families in Scotland. These have helped to prevent more low-income families from pulled further into poverty, but we're going to have to keep these lifelines and build on them with bolder action if we are to hold people steady through this risk period. We know, for example, that if the UK government was to commit now to keeping the lifeline, doing the right thing with the £20 a week increase in some payments, then 1.3 million Scots, again of all ages, would be protected. We know what's been done so far is not enough to get Scotland back on course to achieving those child poverty targets 3 years next spring, and that we're going to need bolder action on good jobs with training, genuinely affordable homes, and a stronger income lifeline for low-income families. This morning, we are absolutely delighted to be joined by the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Kate Forbes, MSP. You'll be hearing from Kate shortly. We're really grateful to have her time at the start of Challenge Poverty Week, and she's with us until about 11:15. You'll also be hearing from our advisory group, and we have a stellar lineup of panelists, people who are challenging poverty in the work they do every single day. A quick word about housekeeping. As participants, your cameras and microphones will stay off throughout the webinar. We have a big number joining us, and we ask you to participate through the Q&A function across the course of the morning. The chat function's been disabled for attendees due to the large number of people, and the session will be recorded and will be available as soon as possible on GRF's YouTube channel and on our website. So before anything else, I'm delighted to to be able to introduce a short film clip to you, a special message that has come from Scotland's First Minister, who can't be here this morning, but she's recorded this message for us to look at now.
In the past 6 months, COVID has exposed and exacerbated inequalities in our society. It has also made the task of tackling those inequalities all the more urgent. Today's event is therefore an important opportunity to discuss how we can build a fairer society as we emerge from this crisis. Kate Forbes, the Finance Secretary, will say more about the government's commitment to tackling poverty shortly. For now, I just want to thank the Joseph Rowntree Foundation for organising this event and all of you for taking part. I hope that the Scottish Government will work with all of you in the months and years ahead as we work together to build a better and fairer Scotland.
So we're really grateful to the First Minister for taking time to record that clip for us. So we've got the GRS mission about solving poverty in Scotland across the whole of the UK, the First Minister's call for us to collaborate, work together, find better, more sustainable ways to build a fairer Scotland. And within that, getting back on course to reduce poverty is a very important part of building a more just and compassionate country. So with those stirring words, we're going to move now to welcome the Finance Secretary, Kate Forbes, MSP. You will know that Kate has been in the job since February of this year. We were chatting earlier and we think that only 6 weeks in, talk about the baptism of fire, lockdown happened. And since then, Kate and her colleagues have been steering the Scottish Government's response to the pandemic, an unprecedented event in our lives on a scale that none of us could have foreseen. Kate has been since 2016 the MSP for Skyle, Harbour and Badenoch, probably the biggest and probably the most beautiful constituency in Scotland. Has had a steady hand on the tiller throughout that time, and we're delighted that she's able to join us from Dingwall this morning to address this challenge of getting through the economic storm and getting Scotland back on track to tackling poverty. A very warm welcome to you, Kate.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. And perhaps it's not appropriate to say that I'm delighted to be here because of the substance of the matters that we're discussing, but I really am absolutely delighted to join you. And having briefly discussed some of those points with some of the other panelists this morning in advance, I'm very honoured to be part of this event. And in the midst of everything else that is happening right now, all the many decisions and the uncertainties and the worries, there couldn't be probably a more important event today as we look ahead to the future. I have a number of different issues at the moment trying to grapple with those, whether it's setting a budget, whether it's new lockdown measures, whether it's the increased rate of transmission of the virus. And in amidst all of those issues is the hugely important issue of families, homes, households and children facing the daily challenge and battle of living in poverty. And you know, the First Minister captured the issues well in terms of the way that COVID and the pandemic have exacerbated some of the structural issues that we have long been battling with. And I've certainly seen it, not just in terms of my finance role from a government perspective, looking out across the entire country, but also as a constituency MSP, where in communities, the length and breadth of my constituency, I've got rural communities, urban communities that are families that have been struggling even more than usual because of the the impact of COVID. And nobody should be in the horrendous position right now in this day and age of going without food. It's completely unacceptable, and we are crystal clear that we must continue to take even more ambitious and even more robust action to deal with it. And that's why Challenge Poverty Week this year it's important every year, but this year in particular, it's important because of the spotlight that it shines on poverty in Scotland. And I certainly, and the government certainly, supports the overarching aim of the week to push towards a more just and a compassionate Scotland, and to achieve that by working in partnership and in collaboration with others to tackle poverty and inequality. And as Cabinet Secretary for Finance, as I said earlier, I have a duty to make sure that we've got the resources to do that very work, to make sure that our policies can be funded and that our policies can be as ambitious as possible. And when it comes to the pandemic, that's been thrown into sharp relief to ensure that funding is continued to target our priorities on child poverty, social security, fair work and housing. And one of the important elements, I think, of me speaking this morning is a reminder that child poverty is not an isolated policy issue. It's not an issue reserved only to the portfolios, for example, of the Cabinet Secretary for Communities or the Cabinet Secretary for Social Security, but it's a priority that has to cut across every ministerial portfolio, because we have a collective duty and responsibility to take forward action to eradicate it completely. And so in my job, I may talk about figures, I may talk about finances, but I know full well that that doesn't capture the humanity, it doesn't capture the individuals, the families, the young people, the children that are facing that daily challenge of despair and worry of living in poverty. And as I said, I see it in my constituency, and I have particular concerns about the hidden nature when it comes to rural poverty in particular. So we know that this is a very difficult time for families and individuals who are living in poverty and facing the increased financial insecurity that has come about as a result of the pandemic. We know the effects of the awful virus. We know that those effects are being felt unevenly. We know that it's particularly keenly felt by the most disadvantaged people and communities. And more than ever, the pandemic has highlighted the need to tackle poverty and inequality, to support people in need. And we have taken significant action in that regard. But I'm very, very clear, and I do not want to say anything through rose-tinted spectacles this morning, very clear that the future is uncertain, and the future is a cause for worry for many, many people. One of the first things that we did when it came to lockdown, the pandemic, in fact, I think one of the first spending asks that I agreed to in mid-March, when we were looking ahead at the prospect of a lockdown, was funding to support communities, £350 million to support communities during the pandemic. And since March, that funding has enabled councils, charities and community groups to be more flexible and to respond as swiftly as they can to help people impacted economically or socially, including and particularly those struggling to access food at the height of lockdown. And the package included about £120 million to tackle food insecurity, with £12.6 million to make sure that 175,000 children and young people were able to access free school meals over the summer holidays. And during that time, we also more than doubled the budget for the Scottish Welfare Fund, making £77.5 million available this year. And by the end of July, local authorities had received almost 120,000 applications, which was a 28% increase on April to July last year, demonstrating just how critical the need has been. It included £80 million of investment to support the third sector and community organisations to keep them going, and also £50 million of hardship fund for local authorities to bring the additional support announced for local authorities to over £380 million. And the last element was a £25 million community and third sector recovery programme to support our third sector in supporting people and communities right across the country. And as I said, in my job, I'm often looking at figures and I'm looking at funding to make sure that we can respond. But each of those applications for funding come about because of need, because of chronic need, because of the inability to access food, or the inability to access support, or the fact that families are concerned and worried about how they're going to be able to eat or to maintain a roof over their head. And that's why it's so important, and I know we'll come on to that when the next panelists are speaking, and I've been very inspired by some of the work that they've been doing, illustrating the individuals and the people that rely on that kind of support. Now, we know that as the pandemic continues, and it's not over yet, so that the future is uncertain. The future is a cause for worry. It's a cause for worry for me, and I'm sure for everybody listening. And one of the key tensions in all of that is how you suppress the virus and how you try and eradicate it, whilst at the same time being very aware of the harms that lockdown is doing, of the economic and the social harms. And one of the points that we've been at pains to make is how we ensure that the increased restrictions perhaps don't come with the disincentive to follow them. In other words, how do we support families to follow the rules? How do we support individuals to keep to the regulations? How do we make sure there's the financial support available? And that's where the self-isolation support grant comes in. It's a £500 grant available for those who face financial hardship due to being asked to self-isolate. And it'll be targeted at people who are in receipt of universal credit or legacy benefits, with some discretion to make awards to others in financial hardship. And applications are due to open from the 12th of October and will be delivered through the existing Scottish Welfare Fund, which is of course administered by local authorities. So that hopefully, I'm in no doubt that there's more that's needed to be done because of the harms that are being done through the lockdown measures. But the hope is that that will be a lifeline for those that are in need of some additional financial support. I wanted to move on to talk about child poverty and some of the policies that we have that were there before the pandemic that have been somewhat impacted by the pandemic, but are more important than ever before. And as Jim alluded to, there has been considerable action taken to tackle poverty before the pandemic. And as highlighted in the second Tackling Child Poverty Progress Report, which was published in August, new estimates reveal that we've increased our investment targeted at children living in low-income households by £144 million to an estimated £672 million in 2019-20. And that is part of an overall package of over £1 billion directed at low-income households through a range of programmes. Now, I don't share those figures from a political perspective or a government perspective to say how well we've done. I share those figures to demonstrate how much need there is out there. And I know that each person listening to this session and any of the questions will be about how much more we need to do and how much more robust action that we need to take. But the report also highlighted that the relative child poverty levels in Scotland, once housing costs are taken into account, are 7 percentage points lower than the UK average. However, the fact remains that almost a quarter of children in Scotland were living in poverty in that year, and that is absolutely unacceptable. And whilst the report looked at some of the milestones and the steps that have been taken, and those are important to reflect on to understand what is working as well as to recognise what isn't working. It looked at the increased support from social security across the early years through the Best Start grant and the Best Start Foods. The Best Start grant early learning and school age payments were introduced in 1920 through the £250 grant. And those were entirely new forms of support to help families with children, helping them to buy the essentials that they need around the time that their child starts school. And more than 75,000 payments were made to families on low incomes through those three elements. There's also right now looking at how we support, what our economic interventions are and how we support transition and how we support people into employment. And a few months ago, it must have been now about 6 weeks ago, in fact, the Cabinet Secretary for the Economy announced new supports to try and help people back into work. And one of the key planks of that policy was the job guarantee for young people. So how we support young people, how we ensure that young people in particular have either a guaranteed job or guaranteed education or training prospects. The last thing that I wanted to mention in terms of additional support was to help parents to access jobs and to increase their earnings through the Parental Employability Support Fund. And that will include an additional boost available this financial year. So all of that is part of a variety of different measures to try and build on the support that was already in place prior to the pandemic, but taking into account the additional pressures that have been caused by the pandemic, particularly when it comes to employability. In terms of dealing with additional costs, there's also measures to try and help reduce household costs and support families in other ways. But as the Poverty and the Inequality Commission has highlighted, all of that action has got to come together to have a positive impact on the lives of children living in poverty. And all of those measures may not sit directly in a silo in government. It may not sit directly under the Cabinet Secretary for Communities and Local Government. It actually sits under different individuals in different portfolios, looking at all the different ways that we need to respond to the pandemic, but also to make sure that all of our policies and all of our responses recognise the fact that so many in this country are still living in poverty and living with the implications of poverty. Alongside my responsibilities for finance, I also have responsibility for digital. And that's perhaps a lens through which you see the impact of policies that haven't taken into account the fact that people live in poverty. I know that whether it's public sector, private sector, too often we are moving to digitalise services and digitalise the ways that we help people, not fully appreciating that for some, they may not be able to access those services and that support without having the digital means to do so. And when it comes to digitalising Scotland, we need to make sure that we're not leaving people behind. And the Connecting Scotland programme is one way of doing that. We saw the digital divide, I think, come into sharp focus during the pandemic, when more and more businesses and more services were moving online. And yet some, whether it was young people unable to access school because they didn't have digital devices or didn't have access to connectivity, or whether it was people trying to access their support, their welfare support without access. And so during lockdown, working with the third sector councils and Scotland's tech industry, we established Connecting Scotland to provide iPads and Chromebooks with internet connections to help tackle the causes and consequences of poverty. The initial priority was helping people that were shielding or at high risk of severe illness, but the programme has now moved to helping care leavers and low-income households with children. And it connects families and hopefully in so doing improves employment prospects and opportunities to access healthcare and education. And one of the key elements of this year's programme for government was really ramping up that programme to provide additional support to more children and more households. In terms of the Scottish Child Payment, which you'll know is designed to provide £10 per child per week, and hopefully combined with the Best Start grant and the Best Start foods that I've already mentioned will mean that low-income families are eligible to receive over £5,000 of support for their first child by the time that they turn 6. Importantly, that scheme, that initiative remains on track. It's been delayed by about 2 months as a result of the pandemic, but it will be open for applications for under 6s in November this year. And the first awards, we hope, will be made to eligible families from the end of February 2021. The 2 months delay, I know, is far from ideal, but it's a significant achievement given the unprecedented challenges for social security and other areas of life as a result of COVID-19. And of course, we know that any further lockdowns or a rise in the virus could reduce staff numbers and could risk that delivery. But like many other programmes, we're absolutely committed to try and prioritise it over the various other things that we have currently running to make sure that we deliver it to time because of the impact it will have on families and on children in particular. So as I draw to a close, which is just a whistle-stop tour, highlighting some of the action that we've taken, but highlighting it to demonstrate that we understand just how critical the need is right now. And that need has only increased as a result of the pandemic. And knowing full well that when it comes to making decisions about how we respond to the pandemic, we need to understand the impact it will have on exacerbating poverty as well. The wide-reaching impacts of COVID are yet to be fully understood, but we know that it is causing harm already. And we are entering a challenging and a largely unknown future. And if I'm saying that as a government minister, how much more so is that sense of worry and concern for families across the country. And as we navigate our way through the next few months and out of the current public health crisis, it's clear that we're going to have to work very closely with other partners and stakeholders and individuals that understand the direct impact of policies on people. I'm determined from a budgetary perspective, a financial perspective, that we continue to lead the way on action to tackle poverty. Whilst we continue to fight against UK government cuts and austerity, we must continue using our own powers to help build a better and a fairer future for Scotland. And as we move to look ahead at economic recovery, getting our health system back up and running, and dealing with the social impact, we've got to do all of that understanding how we deal with poverty at the same time. We need to build on the policies and the practices that we already have in place that have shown the potential to be genuinely transformational. And we're now taking forward a programme of social renewal, which is led by my colleagues, the Cabinet Secretary for Social Security and for Communities. And that will try and shape the new normal that we now want to move into. I think the public certainly are keen to see a fairer society. They are keen to see a more equal economy. We have an opportunity to do that, to get it right as we start to emerge from the pandemic. And if Challenge Poverty Week's key message for today is that together we can redesign our economy to solve poverty, then I'm here to say that government wants to be a key part of redesigning our economy to do that. We know how difficult it is, but I think working together we can reduce. And ultimately, the vision is to eradicate poverty and inequality in Scotland. It's not easy, but it's possible. And there are further ways that we can do that. And I'm sure there will be a greater need to debate and discuss different policies as we come out of the pandemic to know which ones will be truly transformational. And I'll pause there. Thanks very much.
Kate, Cabinet Secretary, thank you very much indeed for that really thorough overview across government as to the response so far and what may be coming ahead. So we've got about 15 minutes to get into some conversation with our participants about what you've said and some of the things on their minds. So I'm going to try and pull some themes together from what we're seeing in the Q&A so far. So one thing that's coming through is the importance of government. I guess this is true for local government too, being as integrated as possible. So seeing this challenge of reducing poverty, promoting a well-being economy, making sure the social enterprises that can help us through recovery are able to do that. So there's a point about how well joined up is government through this period. And then if we take that onto the local level, a real interest in how community anchor organisations and grassroots organisations which are really close to the response day to day can be as resilient and have as much support as possible to be that kind of front line locally to help with this kind of recovery, a recovery that will also tackle poverty. I wonder if you might reflect on those points.
Absolutely. And I think that question about integration is probably one of the most critical questions through the pandemic. Now, one of the challenges in responding to a crisis or an emergency is that you can't do anything like you did it before. So government processes out the window. I realise there's about 500 people listening to this, so don't quote me too far and wide. But you cannot respond to an emergency when you've only got a matter of hours to come to a conclusion without being completely integrated. And that's challenging for governments, it's challenging for public sector, it's challenging for public sector working with the third sector to be that integrated. But I think what we've seen through the pandemic is a new way of working. I see that even across my colleagues, where decisions have been taken, not waiting weeks or even months to come to a conclusion on what the right thing or the wrong thing to do is, but cabinet secretaries sitting down together with, probably having had discussions and conversations at length with third sector partners and other bodies in the public sector, and saying, right, we've got to make decisions that have far-reaching consequences, that have got to do multiple things at the same time. So if I take an example on homelessness, where there have been all manner of very important reviews and debates on how to end homelessness. Now, what we saw during the pandemic was within a matter of hours, a matter of days, it's essentially ensuring that there was very few people, if any, registered as homeless, because we managed to find places for people to stay. Now, the key with that was to work quickly with those that are on the ground dealing with these issues day in, day out, ask what was needed, and then just deliver what was needed, rather than getting into the territory of multiple reports and multiple reviews, which is not to knock reports and reviews. But you can only act quickly, you can only act swiftly, and you can only act effectively if you have that level of integration. If you aren't operating in silos and you've got, whether it's the person responsible for the economy, the person responsible for justice, the person responsible for communities, the person responsible for finance, all working together very quickly to put in place policies that can be delivered almost immediately. So I think we saw much higher levels, far more effective integration during the pandemic. Now, of course, the question will be for third sector partners on this call, whether you think that did work or not. Certainly from my perspective, I just saw far more effective. What I'm keen to do just now is harness that and not lose it. So as we go into our budget process, I want to keep hold of that integration, because it's no good looking at what our isolated policies on poverty are, and then coming over to the economic side and say, what are isolated policies on the economy? And then going over to somebody else, what are our isolated policies on education? That won't work. It needs to be each of those areas coming together to say, well, how do we eradicate poverty? How do we deal with poverty through our respective lenses, with employability, with ensuring that kids get access to their education in a way that helps deal with some of the consequences and the impacts of and the causes of poverty. So that's a long, waffly way of saying I've seen much more effective integration. The question will be, how do you ensure you don't lose it? Now that's within government, that's within the public sector. I think working with third sector, how do we do things differently coming out of, we're not out of it yet, but you know what I mean, looking further ahead. And I think the next test will be, for me certainly, in our budget. So rather than setting each different chapter of the budget on each different element of government, how do we make sure that there's a theme running right through it, which you saw in the programme for government, running right through it, which is our outcome here is to reduce poverty. Can we make sure that each of our other policies is delivering against that objective? Or actually, do we just have a scattergun approach of multiple different objectives, multiple different inputs? I think we need to be much tighter in what are the three things we're trying to achieve. And the three themes within the programme for government were around creating good jobs, meaningful jobs, safe jobs, secure jobs, tackling inequality, and tackling the health crisis. Those were our three themes. Those are the three themes I want to take into the budget and make sure every penny we're spending is actually delivering on that. And if it's not delivering on that, we probably need to stop it.
Great, thank you. It's a really clear answer, and I kind of putting down a marker for what might be in the draft budget and the approach to it later this year that we'll watch with interest. I wanted to take a couple of questions together, which are about the kind of immediate support. So a question about additional support for people who are self-isolating. So you mentioned it will be targeted upon low-income households who are in receipt of kind of qualifying benefits. There's a question that's come in asking about people who are on low-paid, zero-hour jobs, maybe very unpredictable working hours, that for whatever reason has not led people to being in receipt of universal credit. So one question is, for those people who are under the most pressure to be out there back at work and who can't work from home, how do we make sure that discretion is generously applied? And then if it is going through local authorities, there's also a question about how robust is our advice and information infrastructure. We've seen some local difficulties, to put it mildly, around that. I think there are some concerns about the gap between policy and practice. We may well be getting the policy right, but how do we ensure the delivery, the take up, the information is also right? Yeah.
And that last point, again, is an area where I get very frustrated, because sometimes you can very carefully work on guidance, and it's the right guidance and everybody can subscribe to the guidance. But actually, when it comes to delivery and implementation, for various different reasons, it comes unstuck. Now, in terms of the detail, so there is still some work going on, which is why I said it'll be formally launched on the 12th of October. It will, I may have said this already, it will be provided through the existing Scottish Welfare Fund, and there will be, as you said, an element of discretion. There is some work that still needs to be done, and we're looking, for example, on this may not be the what was behind your question, but things like what support will be available to those that can't access support. So what will be available to people with no recourse to public funds, for example? What will be, in terms of the legal basis for the changes that are required to the Scottish Welfare Fund in order to deliver that? There may be some changes to statutory guidance required, and in terms of regulations. But we're also looking at what groups of people we would like to be eligible beyond those that are eligible for the English scheme. So, for example, people that are on low incomes but not in receipt of universal credit, who will face hardship. So I'm probably throwing more questions back at you than answering them precisely, because this is one of the schemes, like others during the pandemic, where we've had to respond quite quickly, and we've wanted to give the clarity early on that we will be launching a scheme, but it doesn't take away from the fact that all the details need to be pinned down. So I suppose my main quick answer is it's on our radar. We're working through it. We're working with local authorities to make sure that not only is the guidance right, the implementation is right, and that it's good to go on the 12th of October. But having heard the question, I will make sure that that is factored in when it comes to launching the scheme.
Thank you. We've got 5 minutes left. I want to try and cover two big pieces of the story, if I may. So one is about housing, and we've seen the Scottish Government's draft infrastructure plan out for consultation now. And I think there's a really strong consensus about the need to continue with an ambitious affordable housing supply programme over the next 5 years or so. So I wonder whether you see the expansion of affordable housing as not just good for driving down poverty, but an important economic stimulus in the years to come. And then the other point is about income security. We have a question that picks up a point in our report this morning about school-aged children. So as things stand, I think there's an understanding about why Social Security Scotland can't open the Scottish Child Payment faster for children aged over 6, but would the Scottish Government consider alternatives in next year's budget, maybe using mechanisms like the school clothing grant as a way to get more money into pockets faster, especially if we see the economic shock continuing to be deeper than we might currently think? So housing and income security, if we may cover those.
Sure. So as you say, the draft infrastructure investment plan, just for context and clarity, that has gone out for consultation, and we will confirm precisely the funding, what's my responsibility, which is a capital spending review, looking at 5 years down the line, what we're investing in, hopefully in December or whenever our budget is published, because there's the equivalent UK government level, and that will set the envelopes that we have. So some of the figures, I would say, just take it at the moment with a pinch of salt, because those figures might be changed. But the one thing you will see in the infrastructure investment plan is continued planned capital investment to deliver more affordable and social homes, because linking that with my first answer about integrated policies, there are few policies that are as effective at both dealing with economic recovery and tackling poverty and providing jobs and ensuring that we tackle fuel poverty and meet our climate change ambitions than building new affordable homes that are to a high standard. So, that is going to continue to be probably one of the government's headline sort of approaches when it comes to all of these ambitions that we have. And I mean, I can go into more detail in terms of housing, but I would say that there's probably a more informed debate to be had in December when we see more substantial figures, but it is going to form a key part of our budget, I would say. In terms of the alternates and how we move faster when it comes to the Scottish Child Payment, we have explored as many options as we can to see if there's a way of either providing additional cash support that's separate to the child payment, or in going further with the Scottish Child Payment. And there's a real tension, and this is going to be a dull bureaucratic answer, but there's a real tension at the moment about how, at a time when, bluntly, systems are just really stretched and people are really stretched. And our priority has been to ensure that the Scottish Child Payment is not delayed as much as possible. I mean, a lot of other schemes and initiatives have been substantially delayed, some of them 9 months or more. We have worked incredibly hard to try and make sure that this one is not delayed. And the difficulty with doing anything else that's substantial is that it does risk the delivery of the Scottish Child Payment. And separately to that, there is just a challenge right now with huge demand, increased demand for the Scottish Welfare Fund, local authorities being quite stretched when it comes to delivering other forms of support. It may not sound like a good enough excuse, but at the moment, those that are on the front line in terms of delivery are being pulled in all different directions. And I think that the bottom line is that to introduce something substantial that's an alternative would delay the Scottish Child Payment. And I think I'd rather see the Scottish Child Payment up and running as quickly as possible than risk delay to that, and rather to do that well than to see that delayed substantially. if we could, we absolutely would. I think that's the bottom line. If we could, we would.
Thank you very, very much. I think we're going to find people on this call, their organisations and many others really committed to seeing if we can find alternatives, really committed to getting behind ambitions around affordable housing. So last week, to abuse my role as chair, I was privileged to launch the Edinburgh Poverty Commission's plan for the capital. And what's very clear is, not just in Edinburgh, but especially there's absolutely no route to achieving our commitments in Scotland on poverty and climate change and well-being economy without a very ambitious approach to affordable housing and social housing in particular as part of that mix. So we are going to take all these points about integration, good jobs, affordable housing, income security into the rest of our conversation. Thank you for joining us this morning, Kate. It's been a pleasure to have you with us. We really appreciate your time and your candid thoughts, especially at such a difficult time at the start of this week. We look forward to continuing the conversation, and delighted to have a finance secretary showing such interest and such commitment and having this kind of holistic view of a challenge that's been with us for a long time. So on behalf of GRF and everyone who's on this call and we're watching back the recording, many thanks for joining us, and we will make sure that other questions, other points that come out of the webinar this morning will be shared with you.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for your ongoing, continued, constructive challenge and thoughtful suggestions and ways in which we can move further, faster, and more robustly tackle these issues. So thanks very much.
Cabinet Secretary, many thanks indeed. So thank you very much for the questions you've been posing. We're not getting through them all. I'm trying to kind of bring ones together and link them together where I can, and specific questions will not be lost from the chat. We will take them and we will be sharing them with ministers and officials after this event. At this point, we're going to move on and look at some of the findings and messages that are in our report published this morning, Poverty in Scotland 2020. And for this session, I'm going to invite my colleague Deborah Hay from GRF Scotland team and our colleagues from our Lived Experience Advisory Group to join us in co-presenting our findings. They are Amy and Brian from Glasgow, Faye in Fife, and Tracy in North Ayrshire. Welcome to you all. Good morning, and thank you for joining us, and more importantly, thank you for the work you've put in over, I think it's now 6 meetings since we first got together. We've tried really hard to go beyond the stats this year and get a sense of what's been happening for people in different parts of the country. We've also been supported by Martha from remote north of Scotland and by Laura from Fife Gingerbread in this process. So we have some things to share with you now. I'm going to move from chair to co-presenter with Deborah and my colleagues. And we should have a bit of time at the end for some questions before we have a short tea break. So we're going to run through what we found and invite our colleagues to offer their thoughts on the issues. My colleague Eleanor is going to work the slides in the Zoom back room. So let's go to the first slide if we may, Eleanor. Thank you. So here's a very quick look on a very small slide, but I'll pick out a couple of the main points. So this is what did we know about the poverty baseline in Scotland going into the pandemic, and the immediate thing we know is that the figures are lagging behind in normal years anyway, the position. So these figures take us up to the end of 2018-19, and we use a 3-year running average. So they are a partial picture, and they are not the most up-to-date picture, but they do tell us the underlying pattern about a year before the pandemic. It tells us something we know already, that just over 1 million Scots of all ages were living in poverty. It tells us that there are higher risks and rates for children, people who rent, for disabled people, lone parents, Black and minority ethnic groups in Scotland, and households who are out of work. That's paid employment. It also tells us that before we even got to the pandemic, as I said earlier, Scotland has been treading water on child poverty. So we were not on course to reach the interim child poverty targets, which have to be met 3 years from next spring. So we have 3 years, hopefully starting, as the Finance Secretary said, with the next phase of bold actions in this year's draft budget, but 3 years to get back on course to reach those interim targets. And with the Scottish Child Payment fully in place, that would do some of the heavy lifting, but we have an unexpected economic shock of unknown severity and duration. And we absolutely will have to make sure that housing and social security, amongst other things, are doing their share of heavy lifting at UK and Scottish levels. So moving to the next slide. Here's a quick look at what we found in the summer. So back in the end of June, start of July, we worked with YouGov in Scotland to undertake a survey of 2,000 adults of all ages. And it looked at the emerging picture on incomes falling, costs rising, and in particular, the financial pressure that was being felt by renters. And Deborah has written a number of blogs about this, and that focus on affordable housing has been an important part of our work over the summer and actually in the run up to the election next May. What this tells us is, even with furlough in place, even with the temporary increases to local housing allowance and universal credit, the impact was felt quite unevenly. And strikingly, it is mainland rural Scotland, plus the islands, that were feeling the strain the most by region in terms of households facing a drop in their income. And you can see for Scotland as a whole, almost 1 in 3 households, even in June, had already experienced a drop in their income. There was a kind of rural focus. In fact, if we update by August of this year, then Moray had the highest proportion of its workforce, 1 in 3, still on furlough at that point. So there's a pattern around the rural economy being exposed for obvious reasons to do with the makeup of the local economy, sectors locked down and reopening more slowly. So on the next slide, I won't read this out, but here's a quote that is from our report this morning. Dundee Fighting for Fairness, one of our partners, one of our grassroots partners in Scotland, conducted a survey over this period, and from over 500 responses, with a particular look at how life has been for disabled people. Here's a comment on general skintness, financial hardship, costs going up. The Cabinet Secretary mentioned food. We've also seen digital, fuel when schools were out, the cost to families around supporting their children's education. And that's before we even talk about the psychological distress that has been felt by families who often are not working from home and are not having the protections that should be in place. So let's move on to the next slide, if we may. So we're going to talk about three themes, four in fact, that are in this year's report. And the first of them is work, and GRF has a commitment to mapping out how good work can be a more certain route out of poverty for many more people in Scotland. So these graphics are telling us two things. First of all, before the pandemic, looking at in-work poverty that affects about 1 in 10 of the workforce. This slide is telling us that risk is very uneven across the economy. So for example, accommodation and food services, hospitality, wholesale and retail sectors, health and social care. Together, these are getting on for more than 4 in 10 of the entire in-work poverty problem in Scotland being concentrated in these sectors. So if there was a way to unlock a route to living wage, living hours, good conditions and voice in the workplace, all the things the Fair Work Convention talks about, if we had a way to apply these in these sectors, we would be very close to springing the trap of in-work poverty. And then the second part of the graph tells us what's happened more in real time around average working hours, and it shows us that for Scotland and, for example, the northeast of England and London, very different parts of the UK, a very consistent drop-off in average working hours, again for obvious reasons, partly to do with furlough, but also driven by big drops in working hours and wages seen in some sectors. So I'm going to pause there, and it's a great pleasure to now introduce Amy, one of our partners and participants from the Poverty Truth community in Glasgow, who's going to say a few words about what the group has found and some ideas for action. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you. Okay, good morning, everybody. I can't see you, but my name is Amy, and I'm speaking here from gratitude position as a person who has been shown compassion in this country. And because of that, I've decided to share my own experience and what I've been seeing in my community. I'm doing it because I believe and dream of a fairer Scotland, like everybody here. So in my community, I've seen people battling to secure a good job by working hard or taking traineeship or doing volunteering jobs, and yet not being able to secure, a job. Or I've seen people being offered jobs that trap them into poverty because there's no progression prospect. I have also seen in my community people losing their jobs due to the COVID-19. I have seen people taking lower paid jobs to be able to take care of their families. Believing in our dream for a fairer Scotland, I'm asking us here to open our hearts and hearts to see what is happening in our communities, in our workplaces, in terms of discrimination, by giving people a chance to secure a good job. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so we have some quotes I'm going to read. So someone in the group said that I will read it, you are being pressured to or need to get a good job to boost your income, but I've got a 1-year-old and I don't qualify for any funded childcare. I know for me personally, finding and affording childcare at this stage makes it even more difficult to get a job. How am I supposed to change my situation? Where do I make the cuts when I'm already on a low income? Someone else said, there's a petition at the moment calling for extending maternity leave. But those of us who have had babies during this time, we are feeling pressured to go back to work, but our babies are not ready. They haven't been socialized or seen anyone. We can't just drop them into childcare. And someone has said, it is a problem that people from Black, Asian, minority, ethnic group are facing discrimination. People with relevant experience and qualification find it difficult to secure a well-paid job. They are either not kept in the organization where the internship has been undertaken or being offered low-paid job. Can we go to the next slide, please? So in the group, we have discussed some ideas to improve jobs. So we said we need to focus more effectively on those most affected, like women, people from Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups, people with disability, people with caring responsibilities, and local areas with labor market pressure. We also spoke about opportunities guarantee for all. We appreciate the opportunity for young people, but we would like opportunity guarantee for all and stronger job retention and training skills to improve pathways into secure good jobs for traineeship. We also spoke about programs such as parental employment support funds and those supporting families with disability. Voilà, we need to, these opportunities need to be increased and extended. And lastly, we spoke about removing barriers in terms of childcare, rural areas, digital, transport, and job design. Yeah, this is what we said. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing a little of the flavour of the group ideas and some of the actions we're calling for in the next budget and over the next 5 years. We're now going to move on to the social security outcome area. And so if we could have the next slide, please. So really briefly, here's one very graphic picture of demand, of need already. It is the rise in universal credit claims as a share of the adult population across Scottish local authorities by the end of July. So we know that across Scotland as a whole, the total number has more or less doubled since January. Here's a breakdown by local areas, and this is an in and out of work benefit. What it's telling us is that places with high poverty rates before the pandemic have already seen the biggest increases. They are mainly in Glasgow and the west of Scotland, but also in the Lothians. So there's one measure, but as I said earlier, rural areas are also at risk. They may not have seen the biggest increases so far, but they're at risk because of the high proportions of people in sectors supported by temporary protections. I mentioned Moray, but also Highland, Scottish Borders, Dumfries and Galloway. So that's a quick look at one measure, but I'm going to now introduce another member of our group, who is Brian Scott, also from Glasgow, who's going to say something about his view of social security. Welcome, Brian. We'll move on to the next slide.
Hello everyone, and I'd like to say good morning to you and thank you for being here today. So who am I? I'm Brian Scott, an anti-poverty activist with the dream of ridding Scotland of poverty, or at least helping to reduce it. I'm a father of two boys, two teenage boys, or fridge emptiers as I like to call them. I'm an ex-nurse who's now disabled and I'm on benefits. But most of all, I'm a proud Scot. And we have a lot to be proud of in Scotland, especially our values which underpin our lives. The values of helping our neighbours, that there should be equal rights and opportunities for everyone, that all citizens have access to free healthcare and education, irrespective of their ability to pay. When it comes to children, we're even more strident in protecting them and giving them equal opportunities and benefits, no matter their background. As I grew up with a strong sense and ethos of we're all Jock Tamson's bairns. We should especially be proud of what the Scottish Parliament has achieved since 1999. It has done so much already to ameliorate poverty in Scotland. It has brought in exemptions to the bedroom tax. Scottish students no longer pay tuition fees. The Parliament has also abolished prescription fees so that no one has to miss out on treatments because they can't afford to pay. I could go on, but now you see why our Parliament makes me so proud. But, and it's a big but, there is still poverty and suffering in Scotland. There are still children going to school hungry. The number of food banks opening is continually rising. There are still people living in fear of that bill coming through the door, or the brown envelope from the DWP calling them to attend an interview or assessment, or saying there is a change or mistake in their benefits. Fear of the click of the electricity meter going off as it runs out of power and you don't have the money to top up the card. If you're on low pay or a 0 hours contract, the fear of not getting enough shifts to make enough money to get your family through the week. And now, to make things even more interesting, we have COVID-19 and lockdowns. So what does COVID-19 mean to me and my family? Fear, pure and simple. Will we catch it? Will I be able to buy enough shopping to feed myself and two teenage boys if we're in lockdown? Will I be able to make up the increase in electricity costs as my boys watch TV more and use two school-issued tablets to access online schooling? You'll notice there's a consistent thread running through this narrative: fear. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, when you live with and in poverty, your life is dominated by fear. So what can the Scottish Government and other agencies such as the third sector do to alleviate this fear and stress? It could provide a safety net or a social security, if you like. First of all, as some of our fellow citizens are experiencing thanks to COVID-19, the benefit system is confusing, bureaucratic and downright terrifying. The Scottish Government, alongside partner agencies, could use the powers they have to declutter and simplify the benefit system. There could be a more holistic and joined-up approach when providing services to those who are experiencing or are already on the benefit system. With other agencies, a one-stop shop or hub could be set up, housing the DWP and other advice specialists, could even have some NHS representatives. A more joined-up system could be established between the DWP departments and agencies to share information and help reduce the endless stream of forms they have to fill in. There is now widespread recognition that being in poverty brings with it health and societal problems. A large percentage of those in poverty and on benefits suffer from some form of mental health or physical ailment. The daily struggle of living life with very little money puts a strain on your ability to cope with life and can hinder your power to make decisions or think clearly. It puts strain on all your relationships. Marriages suffer and break down. Relationships with your children, friends and family are all put under a great deal of stress. Eventually you can't cope and you break. The Hub could have agencies on hand such as NHS to help those experiencing mental health problems. The Scottish Government is moving forward with its aim of reducing child poverty in Scotland, and I commend them for that. By the end of 2020, it's hoped the first stage of the Scottish Child Payment Scheme will be up and running. However, to begin with, it's only for children under the age of 6. Children between the ages of 6 to 16 will miss out on this payment for at least a year. Their poverty hasn't gone away or been put on pause, it's still there. The cost of raising children in 2020 is astronomical and rising every day. They need help now. Our children can't afford to wait for help no matter their age. By far, one of the major contributors to putting people into poverty had been the benefit freeze and benefit cap. Until recently, all benefits, with the exception of the old age pension, have been frozen and its link to inflation removed. The UK government has lifted the freeze and reinstated the link to inflation. However, this is updated only every 4 years, leaving benefits at the 2015 level. In reality, this means that as the cost of living increases, those in benefits don't have the relief of that link to inflation to ameliorate the rises in the cost of living. This means that the money you receive is worth less and less in real terms. During the lockdown and the pandemic, those in universal credit have been grateful that the UK government has given them £20 a week extra, but it only lasts for a year and doesn't extend to those yet to move over to universal credit, such as me on PIP. In fact, what is ultimately needed is some form of minimum income guarantee for all citizens linked to the cost of living, thus providing a cushion to all those on low incomes. Ladies and gentlemen, when you're in poverty, it can be like walking through thick mud, carrying a backpack full of weights. The more you try to go forward, the deeper you sink. The deeper you sink, you become increasingly tired and frustrated until you feel that you can't go on any further and give up. Surely it's not too much to ask that we help lighten the load of our fellow Scots. I'm asking everyone here to stretch out your hands and help pull our brothers and sisters out of the quagmire of poverty. After all, as the great Rabbi Burns reminds us, we are all Jock Tamson's bairns. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. We're now going to hand over to Deborah to lead on the housing theme.
Hello, hello. Could we have a housing slide, please, Eleanor? Brilliant, many thanks. So this has been a crisis that has hit renters particularly hard. Those are more likely to be on quite modest incomes. They spend more of their income on housing costs. They tend to have fewer or no savings, and they've certainly had fewer ways to reduce their costs in the short term as this crisis has hit. We know that rents in the social sector have also been rising for lots of understandable reasons, but rising social rents and the impact of welfare reform have meant that we are seeing rising poverty rates in this sector. And if we don't find ways to stabilise that, we risk driving people further into poverty or worse, out of their homes. Rents in the private rented sector present a more mixed picture over the very long term. Nationally, certainly over the last 10 years, they have increased above inflation, maybe not as much as you might think, but some modest wage growth and less reliance on benefit income for the people who live in this sector has protected some of the tenants there. So we've seen a small fall in the poverty rate of private rented sectors. But when you look at regional and local level, you see these huge variations above inflation rent increases. Glasgow, Edinburgh and Lothians, Forth Valley and Fife for most property sizes. So the graph you can see here is for 2-bedroomed properties, which are the most common, but you see a very striking picture in family accommodation also. As Jim said earlier, there's really no route to achieving the child poverty reduction targets without more families on low incomes who have children moving into more affordable homes. Even pre-COVID, the strain on our housing system was really apparent. Rising numbers of families with children trapped in temporary accommodation and staying far longer, waiting for their settled accommodation, and significant numbers locked into after housing cost poverty only because of their high housing costs. So that's some 30,000 children. If we were able to target support to those families, reduce their housing costs and lift them out of poverty, that would have a similar sort of magnitude of game-changing impact as a Scottish Child Payment. So in addition to the people who were already struggling pre-COVID, more and more people, as we've seen from the earlier slides, who are facing reduced hours, calling on support for their housing costs, maybe more than usual, or possibly for the first time, they're coming up against that gap between what they have to pay in rental or mortgage costs and what's available in the system to support them. So we know the UK government acted quickly and increased the local housing allowance for private rental costs so that it would cover at least the bottom 30% of rents in an area, and we know that that's had a very positive impact where there were huge gaps in places like Edinburgh. In the full report, you'll see graphs which show the size of the remaining gap between costs and the support available in the private sector for an average 3-bedroom family property in Glasgow and Edinburgh, reaching something like £40 to £50 per week, which is a huge gap. So whilst the increased rates have offered some additional help to those who are already receiving support with their housing costs pre-COVID, folks who are new to the system, who are much more likely to be in accommodation that costs more than the bottom 30%, will be discovering for the first time that they need to meet that gap out of their remaining income. We've heard today from the Cabinet Secretary that the Scottish Government acted quickly to channel extra money into both the third sector and also into crisis funds at local levels, so boosts to Scottish Welfare Fund and discretionary housing payments, but the evidence is a little mixed about the extent to which that's reaching the people who need it quickly enough, particularly with discretionary housing payments, and those budgets are not seeing the level of demand we might have expected. More recently, they've announced a £10 million tenant hardship fund to offer tenants who are struggling to meet their rental costs interest-free loans to tide them over. So for households for whom loan finance is appropriate to meet perhaps a short-term gap, this could be obviously a better option than more expensive commercial rates, but that fund will require incredibly careful targeting, independent money advice, very patient repayment terms, and options to write off unpayable debt. We also welcome the commitment that we've heard about this morning from the government for an indicative £2.8 billion for a new affordable housing supply programme post-2021. Although we would note, notwithstanding that we should take these figures with a pinch of salt, that it's short of what the sector's called for, and it will take some time for those homes to start to reduce demand. So looking at the scale of the challenge, the existing strain that we've seen in existing polls, our own and others, the increase in the number of people who require help with their housing costs over the short to medium term, certainly, and the huge scale of demand for affordable homes in the immediate future, we're probably not persuaded that the measures announced to date will be enough. We can't add further pressure into local housing and homelessness systems by allowing people to accrue arrears and risk losing their homes at this time, and relying on crisis and discretionary funding to fill what is effectively a systemic housing cost gap is not going to offer hard-pressed families the security they need. So both UK and Scottish Government will need to work with landlords and lenders and potentially to step in with additional legislation or certainly help with housing costs if this proves insufficient to support people to stay in their homes meantime. I'm going to hand over to Faye, who is my partner in crime on the housing section. Faye.
Hello, thank you. So I am going to focus on my own experiences in my little spiel, but I will touch on things that were discussed in the research group we did. So my own experiences were being offered an empty shell of a property when my daughter and I were in quite dire straits, which is why our advisory groups call for social landlords to create more than just an empty home, a house, bricks and mortar, to actually create a home. And as you can see from the quote on our screens, it's not just me that has that. I'm not alone in my experiences either. So I was offered a tenancy just at the point that lockdown was hit, and it was kind of a take it or leave it situation. So there were no floor coverings, no white goods, furniture, nothing. And my daughter and I, who at the time was just learning to crawl, really needed somewhere safe to stay due to my circumstances. I kind of had to leave quite quickly. We had absolutely nothing, not even a bed to sleep in. So despite asking for help through all the means available, through things like the Scottish Crisis Grant, the Welfare Fund, all the rest of it, I had no other option than to take out an advance payment with Universal Credit, as the grant applications were all denied. I'm now living on £70 less than I would normally on Universal Credit due to the advance that I had to take out. And when, yes, the money came in handy and it was fantastic because it helped me buy the bare essentials like a bed, a mattress and a washing machine. As you can well imagine, it didn't help with the other things that every home needs. So I was offered a paint pack, which meant I could get so many things of paint from a local distributor. My carpets were delivered the day of lockdown, and the money used to pay for those carpets was my parents' money. I'm still repaying them back. I had no internet connection, and as anyone who's been locked down in the last 6 months, like we all have been, will contest that internet has been absolutely vital. But I couldn't get an internet connection. I couldn't change my gas and electric meters. I had key meters, and when you're locked down and you're unsure and you've got a very young child, you don't want to be going to top them up and things like that. So I was put in a situation that I was very much locked in and couldn't, save money. Instead, I was having to fork out more, like everybody else, on gas and electric because we were in all the time. And as it was said earlier, there's no guarantee that you're not going to have that money to put on. So it's a massive stressor for everybody who's experienced that type of thing. So I said about creating homes, not just tenancies, ensuring that there are some principles that we can see within social security, ensuring that the dignity of the tenant is respected and they sustain self-respect as well. Oh, sorry, next slide. We know that the government and partners are going to enable a duty of preventing homelessness. We want that to be understood as ensuring people have practical support and need to stay in a home and not just a house. Kindness and building a good relationship and really understanding the situation of the tenants are facing is as important as the value for money. So one thing that is believed that could help is landlords could do more, or perhaps consider doing more to help tenants secure the best deals and keep their costs down, such as helping with bundle of goods such as utilities, or helping them find the best internet provider or gas and electric deals out there, because not everybody has the know-how to do that. Ensuring that there is a proactive relationship between landlords and tenants, so not only to help with the prevent homelessness movement, but also to ensure that the complete health and well-being of the tenant is maintained, so that there isn't that fear that was previously discussed regarding the possibility of going homeless. So if there is a proactive relationship between the two, we can ensure that that homelessness number is kept down, especially given the current climate. And finally from me, affordability for rent for tenants is a huge issue. As shown on a previous slide, the gap between average incomes and average housing costs is far too wide in many areas, and there's such a huge variation in standards of property as well. So in some places you might get if needed, of course, a 3-bedroom property that's got a lovely garden, a driveway, for the same price as a pokey 3-bedroom flat in a different area of Scotland. So I think that there is a massive difference in supply and demand, not supply and demand, completely lost my words, I do apologise. So yeah, the standards are far too different. Especially with the forthcoming recession, we need to make housing more affordable for people on low or modest incomes so that they can maintain their house, but most importantly, retain their self-respect. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Faye. Deborah, why don't you introduce our final theme and speaker?
Lovely. So our final theme is about voice. It's about participation, and equal participation at that. And I'm delighted to welcome Tracy, if she is able to join us and talk through what the advisory group talked about.
Hello. Yes. We spoke about voice, and we made some comparisons with some of the really good work that's already been done in this area, and we looked at the promise that came from the care reviews. So I'll touch a wee bit on that. I'll briefly say something about my experience. I've experienced poverty firsthand. I went from a really good job and career as a social worker to struggling to make ends meet, living on benefits. So I've experienced the powerlessness that comes with living in poverty, and as a mum of 2 wee girls as well, the shame and guilt that comes with that. And I think that's been a theme from the work that we've done, is the emotional impact that poverty has, and it's probably not recognised as much. We looked at, when we consider Scotland wants to be the best place in the world to grow up, and then we look at the number of people that are living in poverty, the number of children that are still living in poverty, we can see that while there's loads of great work that's been done, we're still missing the mark, because we still have children, families and individuals impacted. Kate Forbes spoke earlier on about, she made a really, really good point about working with people that are on the ground and just doing what was required during the pandemic. And I think that's really my opinion, that we need to continue to bridge the gap between policy, research and all the knowledge and experience that's out there, and bring that together with the lived experience and make it effective and bridge the gap between what we know and actually what's happening on the ground. The question is about how that can be done, and that's where we looked at the care review and the promise, and how that's demonstrated the power of voice and the potential to create social change by listening to the experiences of people. It's also shown, what could be, the potential by involving people who are experts just by virtue of their experience, and taking that experience and making something meaningful from it. And it's a great opportunity to learn from the work that's already been done through the promise, and thinking about how we can take that into the lived experience of poverty and how we create social change from there. We also considered, the idea of co-production, and there's still very much an idea of decisions being made in a direction being taken, but those who are living day-to-day in poverty still being on the outside, on the outskirts of that, and not being fully involved. And co-production is a really, really powerful way of bringing that together. If we look at the Fairer Scotland duty as well, tackling inequality is at the heart of decision making, and again, there's an opportunity to involve people who are going through these situations and bringing in the element of co-production. If we base that on the foundation of voice, we could look at key areas such as working with Scottish ministers and our local authorities and our health boards and courts and tribunals. Something that was a key element that came up through the advisory board was that the the key organisations that we're involved with in our local authorities really don't listen to what we have to say, and the policies, etc., that are in place don't really, they don't create the change that we need, and they don't create the impact that we need either. So again, it comes back to that gap. If we looked at bringing all of this together, we could create advisory boards in various places, just very much like we've done today, and bringing all of this together for GRF in this session today, using the voice of people who are ready and willing to share their experience and who are keen to be part of creating that change. And within that, there's a real opportunity to move away from systems that don't work. And I think, you know, throughout today we've heard of various systems that don't work, and we could shift towards an approach that is based on voice, on truth and kindness and compassion, that actually makes the change that we're desperate to see in Scotland. And it creates that joined up approach that works. Again, that's been mentioned, you know, at the beginning of the Cape Forbes. And it's an opportunity for Scotland not to do things better, but actually to do better things. And I think that's where we could really see the change. I'll finish there.
Tracy, thank you so much for rounding off the advisory group's input to the process and helping to create a really rounded picture of life in a low income this year of all years. Thanks also to Faye and Brian and Amy and to Deborah for their role in that presentation. We're going to go now straight into our panel discussion. We have 5 panelists, all of whom are working across the themes and beyond that you've heard already, day in, day out in Scotland. And we wanted to invite this panel because they embody in many ways what is possible, what can be achieved despite the headwinds, despite the storm that we are facing. So I'm going to introduce them to you. They are Dr. Susan Actimel, who's the Exec Director of Homes for Good Social Business Group. Anthony Burns, Chief Operating Officer for ACS Clothing, a living wage employer based in Lanarkshire. Tressa Burke, who's Chief Exec of Glasgow Disability Alliance, which now has over 5,000 members. Viana Maya, the founder and talent development coach at Prespect, whose mission is to provide career coaching services for underrepresented talent in Scotland. And last but not least, Paul McNamee, editor of The Big Issue now for all national and regional editions, as well as online. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us for this panel session where we think about what needs to change to get Scotland back on track. And an opening question to each of you, and then we'll look at what's coming through the Q&A feeds. Really broad one, if you could tell us what has this period, this pandemic meant for the job that you do, and what's helped or hindered your work over this time. Shall we start with Susan, please?
Thank you, Jim. It's been a roller coaster of a time for us. I think as one of, I think it was maybe Faye that mentioned about the importance of relationships between landlords and tenants, and at Homes for Good, our whole business model is based on values and the relationships that we have with people. So we put all of our focus and attention onto that as soon as the lockdown happened. The first thing that I felt I needed to do was understand the safety of the organisation and the financial safety of the organisation and what it meant for us, and very quickly get my head around with my team, all of our tenants and where they were in terms of a whole number of things, like the risk to their employment, whether they were self-isolating, all sorts of different things that we had to very quickly find out. And the reason that we just worked at 100 miles an hour to do that in the first couple of weeks of this all happening. And the reason that I wanted to create this level of having very detailed knowledge about what was going on, and also just on knowing that our organisation was financially safe, was that then enabled me to show my team that we were safe. And that in turn, most importantly, enabled them to create a sense of as much safety and certainty as they could with all of our tenants. So we were lucky that through funding that we got last year, we were able to, we had a lot of tenancy support going on within Homes for Good, and that has absolutely saved our bacon, I would say, and our tenants. It's meant that one of the things that we also did was we moved very fast. And because we are a small organisation that is unregulated, one of the benefits of being unregulated sometimes is that you can do the right thing very quickly and ask for forgiveness later. So while we were trying to get registrations for our tenants for food supplies and things, we just delivered them ourselves directly. The team were empowered to just do whatever was needed to be done to make sure that people were looked after. And we then spent time working on engaging our tenants through all different sorts of things, engaging the children of our tenants, doing all sorts of arts activities, afternoon teas, all sorts of different things that was about trying to just keep people engaged and connected. On one hand, we were able to work really well because we already knew how to work remotely. We all were equipped to do that. But one of the biggest challenges is around having relationships. And I think there's been mentioned earlier by Kate Forbes and by other people about digital. We're all moving to digital, but for people that are the most marginalised, that is challenging on a number of fronts. It's challenging because they don't have access to the hardware or internet, and they maybe don't have the skills to be able to do that as well. So I think on one hand, what we've been hindered by is our inability to work face to face with our tenants in the way that we normally do, because it's at the heart of what we do. What we've seen as work though is that, you know, in a funny sort of way, the pandemic has been a great leveller. We're all in the same boat. So, you know, tenants who do not have issues around poverty were self-isolating. We saw lots of community engagement and community spirit that came through in the communities where we have our homes, and a lot of kindness and commitment to helping people. So there's been good and bad come out of things, and what we're focusing on is how we protect our tenants going forward and maintain the momentum of the good things that we've all been able to do together.
Susan, thanks very much. We're going to come back to each of you with other questions as we go, but I'd like to maybe go to Anthony next, maybe to pick up this question from the perspective of a living wage employer. Anthony.
Thanks, Jim. Well, at ACS, we're a clothing rental company. Our volumes are driven by parties, events, functions, and predominantly weddings. So COVID, basically, our order book fell off a cliff overnight, and we're still struggling with the restrictions. However, we have a plan to see us through to 2021, and lockdown in many ways gave us as a team an opportunity to take a step back, to look at strategy, look at where we're going, reached out to different organisations, engaged with our existing partners, and to be honest, it was a very productive time, which we would never have got ordinarily. So we've managed to realise some new sales opportunities, which will come to fruition in 2021. So it also has expedited change in the fashion industry. Consumers are recognising that they can't be as unsustainable in their choices. So, you know, we expect some exponential growth in coming years, starting next year. Our order bank is already up 100% next year. So, you know, we expect also to create some good jobs off the back of this. And we've set up ACS as an SQA accredited training centre. We'll be offering SVQs, and we have a variety of initiatives to try and support this growth. We're going to be starting with the Kickstart scheme. 30 young adults will be starting with us, and we'll be offering them SVQs. And we've taken the time out during lockdown to build training plans, which will encompass interpersonal skills and just helping build confidence in our new starts. So, you know, lockdown, as much as it's had a very detrimental impact initially, the medium to longer term is looking a lot more positive.
Great. Thanks, Anthony. And well done on your living wage accreditation, really important bit of the picture that goes into fair work. Let me come to Vienna. Vienna, we've got to know each other through the process around Edinburgh that I mentioned earlier, but you work more widely than that. Please tell us a little about what this last period has meant for your work.
Yeah, absolutely. So as a pre-spec, we're probably considered grassroots. We've come through the SIB funding, and obviously through the pandemic, we've had to adapt, move quickly in real time to, I mean, we work in employability, but we found we had to bring in well-being, food support for some of our participants, because there were access, there was support, there were things going fast around people, but there were a lot of people that were sifting through the net that were not accessing the resources that were there. So over the last 6 months, I think this is probably the first month we've actually been able to sit down and reflect. But over the last 6 months, everything has gone digital. We've had to create wellbeing space in terms of our training. So I provide spaces for people that were isolated. Most of our candidates live alone or are single parents. So creating spaces where people could come and talk about what they were going through in terms of their personal life, and then also focus on employability. Is really about giving them that hope that things were going to happen, there were change happening, there were information out there that sometimes just people didn't want to look at the news. For example, as we know, we were getting various feedback, various information about the support that were there, but for a lot of people that was a bit overwhelming, a bit too much. So we found that as an organization, we had to really adapt the resources, the support, the connection that were lacking. And again, it took away from employability and more into well-being, more into the mental health awareness that we had an individual who found that the counselling support they were accessing suddenly closed. So that meant we had to be the people to offer that, that personal approach, a human-centered approach. Somebody had in the group question, I think it was Terry, talking about the interconnection of what we offer, and really understanding, although our umbrella is employability, we've come to be that holistic support that people need in a community. To understand that to be able to really break through poverty, people need to know that where they go to, they're going to be able to provide access, other support to help them get into the mindset of that job if the opportunity comes. But it has been working in real time. It has been, the funding that we're part of, as Jim mentioned here, we were allowed that flexibility to convert some of our funding and provide emergency food. So we're an organization with 3 people, so we don't have access to bring food into us. So we were researching, and we used M&S food boxes, Morrison's food boxes, which meant that people could contact us and say, I don't have access to food today or this week, how can you help? We can then send or ship food to be delivered. Digital was again an issue, as some of the individuals were supporting also had children that were homeschooling. There was no access. We heard about the Connect in Scotland, but because of the criteria that were placed, people didn't always tick the right boxes to access that. So again, those blocks were in place. So it was looking at how do we bring what we had face-to-face, which we did a lot of work in Glasgow and Edinburgh, into a digital space, but also be aware that there were people that couldn't access the digital. So that meant, again, phones were necessary for people to have that contact. And I think for us, because we're so small and we've only just properly started, we're again, as Susan said, we're able to adapt quickly and then ask for forgiveness later, because people needed that help now and then in that second. And I think what I would love is us as organizations here to be able to have a network, a space where we can all connect and say, this is what I'm doing and this is what I need. This is a person that's come here and this is what they need. How can you support and how can I support, so that we can then really have a proper holistic support where people, as we said in the report, are not just going from one place to another, and that exhaustion, that being aware that well-being, mental health is really affected right now in terms of the pandemic. So yes, I could go on for days. That was us.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really good reminder that you're about employment and talent and overcoming discrimination. But before you can do that, there's a kind of basic needs that have to be addressed before people have the stability and the confidence to be able to look ahead. It's a kind of common theme, you're right, that comes through the reporting this year. Let me come to Tressa next. Same question for you, Tressa. And already in the chat, we've had questions about disability assistance, social security, and also employment. And we know that disabled people have been amongst the most affected already by reductions in working hours and redundancies. I wonder what this time has meant for your work with GDA.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, just building on what everybody else has said, really similar experiences of having to adapt everything that we do and create new supports and provisions as well. So one of the things that we have discovered is that we might all have been in the same storm, but we have absolutely not been in the same boat. And some people don't have the same lifelines, and disabled people are absolutely amongst that group. So one of the things we did was immediately at the outset of lockdown, we got ourselves organised to go home and be safe as a staff team, but immediately the first priority was to contact our members, of which we have 5,000 plus, and make sure they were okay and find out what they needed. And we ended up undertaking a massive engagement exercise, which was primarily based on wellbeing checks to check how they were. Our normal work is about programmes of learning and support and capacity building to build people's voices and to build people's confidence and connections and access to services and opportunities. But a bit like Vianna, it is a very holistic model based on community development and based on the principle that the people most affected by inequality should be involved in the solutions to tackle it. So following this extensive engagement, what we found was that people were extremely worried and concerned. So having spoken, I think we made 6,000 calls up until the end of July. We received 2,500 to a helpline that we set up, and 47% of people were concerned about food and medication. 57% were concerned about money. Those numbers did start to increase. They have increased since the end of July, and obviously things were starting to get better and then they've got worse again. So 60% of our members are digitally excluded. 1,884 social care packages were cut in Glasgow at the outset of lockdown. And this is a complex picture because 650 social care staff went off sick. So it wasn't a crass decision to erode disabled people's human rights, but it did. And that's something that people were left dealing with. So there's lots and lots of things. 80% of disabled people that we spoke to, and we spoke, as I say, to over 5,000, didn't know where to go for information and advice. So one of the things that hindered us was that the fantastic community responses, which of course we commend and support, didn't include disabled people. So there was wonderful work, but there wasn't tremendous collaboration supporting disabled people, despite the fact that at the outset of all of this, people decided to get together a shielding list to protect people because they saw them as the most vulnerable. So there are some kind of ironies in that. And that still seems to be something that's not been mitigated maybe as well as it can. One of the things that really helped us was we got additional funding. We got that really quickly. And I think that the way that the Scottish Government tackled speaking to organisations and trying to connect with grassroots organisations like ourselves was really brilliant. So that helped us. But the thing that hindered and still is hindering is that basically the world and society and organisations are not designed with disabled people in mind. And so therefore responses leave us behind.
Tressa, thank you so much. We'll come on in a couple of minutes into some of the specific actions we need to see happen coming out of this phase. But I want to turn to Paul from Big Issue. Paul, I mean, of all groups, in terms of visible impacts and kind of consciousness about risks, I mean, people who are street homeless have been very much in people's minds, and so I'm really keen to hear your view of what has happened and the difference it's meant for your work.
Thanks, Jim. I would say that there's probably two parts to this, and I will try and be brief. There is the part when lockdown happened, and then just post-lockdown and what that has meant. Initially, when lockdown happened, that meant a huge, dramatic, and it could have been cataclysmic change to the way the big issue works, because, as you know, we operate in a model that those who are homeless, whether it's street homeless or maybe not visibly homeless, they buy the magazine from the big issue and sell it. They pay half the cover price and then sell it to the public, and that half is the income they make. Now, when lockdown happened and we took vendors off the street just before, because they were at risk, that meant that in one moment, around, on average, 60 to 70,000 magazine sales a week across Britain, not just Scotland, were gone. And that meant all that money that was earned by people who had no other means of income was gone. So we had to do, within that, two things quickly. One, make sure that we could find a way of getting them money to help them, and also to make sure that the big issue could in itself make some income so it could carry on, because we knew that when this was over, we would be needed. We became essentially a handout organization. We'd been a hand up, not a handout, and we flipped that around. So we started very quickly changing the model. We'd never really had a subscription element to us. We started selling subs. We hadn't sold in retail. We went into shops. We hadn't had any proper digital presence. We very quickly built an app, and we had to do all these bits around the magazine with people who were working remotely and themselves feeling fragile. But they knew that they were doing this for a particular reason. We got a lot of help from people, a huge amount, well of support, reservoirs of support from well-known figures who wanted to either donate themselves or support people taking subscriptions. And what that meant was that we were able to build up a fund of several £100,000 that we could immediately distribute to those who were most in need of it. And that went out to our vendors, around 14 to 1,500 vendors, and it was £600,000 to £700,000 over the period in supermarket vouchers, in direct money, or whatever else they decided they needed in the time. I remember there was a particular vendor who she was disabled, feeling very cut off, and worried about her health. We managed to get her a rowing machine, which, for her, that meant the world. We were able to get it relatively cheaply. We had that money. We were able to do something. And it was those kind of small victories that made us very proud during the period. Afterwards, we then had to change very quickly and get ready for vendors going back onto the streets. We had to make sure that we bought the right PPE so that they felt safe and the public felt safe approaching them. But more importantly, we had to make sure that they could accept cashless payments. Now, this wasn't just a matter of buying a load of card readers and phones and then handing them out to vendors, because we would have done that if it was as straightforward as that. What we really needed to do was to encourage people who perhaps had never been banked in their life or had no experience of using technology, or indeed of being within that particular system, of coming in. So during lockdown, there was a lot of training going on for vendors to allow them to do this. And now we've got around 30 to 40% of vendors who accept cashless payments. That was very, very important. So what it has allowed us to do was to, sorry, my dog's getting very excited, was to allow people who had been incredibly marginalized to have some support, and then to bring them in post-lockdown so they're less marginalized. And one other thing about Jim, one key thing that we're trying to do within the pages of the magazine, so that's the mechanics, that's what we do with the actual sale. Within the pages, we're now looking at how we can help those who are right on edge to make sure that they don't fall over the edge. So as before, we were very focused on those who were outside, who were our vendors. Now we're equally focused on people who essentially were our readers. Because of their risk of job loss, we want to make sure that they don't fall into homelessness, because we heard some particularly telling testimony, I think, from Brian and Tracy about the emotional, the impact of poverty and what that does to you. And we don't want that to happen. And we want, as a big issue, to do what we can. So we'll set up an organization, an alliance. We're calling it RORA. It's the Ride Out Recession Alliance. we're looking for as many organizations, as many people, as many corporates or third sectors or whoever who've got ideas and thinking, and it could be the sort of thing that Anthony was mentioning there, Vianna, the idea of people coming together with ideas to say, right, here's how we can stop people becoming homeless in the first place. Here's how we can keep them in jobs, and here's how we can prevent a greater growth of poverty. And that, in brief, is where we are.
Paul, brilliant. Thank you so much. Really compelling and really valuable actually to have those insights and to understand what happened in those different phases and how you had to shift really quickly, as you all have had to change your response over the one you would have been ideally continuing with. So we have got about 5 minutes left, never enough time for these conversations. So I'm going to give you all a minute each in the next question and try and weave in a couple of thoughts as well from our participants. So I'm going to come to Anthony and Vianna first. So the question for all of you actually is what next? What has to change? What barriers removed or positive support put in place? And in particular, there's a question, let me see, from Martina asking about how we can keep equality, diversity, inclusion at the forefront of our thoughts in the work we do. And as Tressa was saying, sometimes that's there, but it isn't always there in a proactive sense. It isn't there in putting people, giving them the tools to kind of get on and do the jobs they want to do. So I wonder, Anthony, then Vianna, what next? What's going to help get us through the storm?
I'll chip in quickly. I know we're tight for time. Certainly in terms of inclusion, in terms of employment, we've been recruiting from disadvantaged backgrounds. We've been working with Scottish Enterprise, DYW, Routes to Work to ensure that we have a diverse workforce. We currently have employees on site from the Scottish Prison Service who are currently doing time, but hopefully what we're doing will help with rehabilitation and reduce the chance of reoffending in communities. So what we're trying to do is inherently different from the allegations of what's happening in the Midlands and in Leicester, where allegations of people being paid £3 per hour, working when ill, no recognition of health and safety around COVID, and manufacturing for a string of top UK fashion brands. We're trying to do things differently, better at ACS.
Thanks, Anthony. Vianna?
Jump in. So currently I work with AI employability, so I'm supporting them with the diversity and inclusion work. So we've been working with employers during the pandemic, so having two heads here working with people and employers. And we've been talking about this conversation of bringing back the idea of diversity and inclusion as part of this Build Back Better. Obviously, a lot of employment have paused and people coming back into it. Is about understanding what's happening now, what's affected the community, especially those that have been affected in terms of getting into work, and how do you bring that inclusion and diversity back into, especially recruitment processes, because there's been issues there. So that's part of my work that I do with AI employability, is supporting employers, working either with them individually or working within a group.
Thanks, Vianna. I'm going to come to Susan then Paul on the kind of different ends, I guess, of the housing challenge. So again, that question, what's needed, either barriers removed or positive help put in place? Susan first.
Yeah, I think, through your report, you use language like kindness in the housing sector and working with compassion and dignity for people. And I think those human things need to be at the front of all of our behaviours across the public sector and the voluntary sector, across the whole of our society. Funding channels need to be simplified. I think Tressa talked about the way that the third sector funds, the Scottish Government flung the money out the door to all of us in a fast way that enabled us to respond quickly. That momentum can't be lost. Universal credit and LHA cannot go back to the levels it was at before. That would be criminal to do that. And we need to collectively find a way of saying yes rather than saying no, and just keeping working around barriers, keeping the people that we care about at the centre of it. The final thing that I will say is there must be significant improvements in the DWP in the way that they process people's benefits, because what we see is that that is the major challenge and the major cause of stress for a number of our tenants is the lag time and the wait to get outcomes and get results. So you were talking about DHP not being fully drawn down. It's not for the want of trying. So they're the sorts of things that we just need to all up our game in terms of how we work to look after people.
Thanks so much, Susan. And over to you, Paul.
In terms of what's next and what can be done, I think that it's, as everybody's touched on today, we're in such unknown territory that things that we thought may have worked and been useful 6 months ago, a month ago, 3 weeks ago, may not necessarily be the way forward. From our perspective, within the big issue, we have, as I mentioned in that introduction, we have two focuses. That is the people who sell the magazine and the people who read the magazine. And that, I think, encompasses quite a lot of the population who are either in poverty or at risk of poverty. For those who are in poverty, we need to make sure that they have means to get out of it. And for us, that's providing them with income, if we can, plus any other scaffolding that may be useful to them, whether we give it to them directly or we direct them to some great organizations like we have here who can help them better than we can. And the other is to make sure that people don't collapse into the mire. We see different politicians and different political parties coming up with what they think are solutions. And I have to give them some credit, because it's easy, particularly as a journalist, to really have a go at them and say, look, you need to do more. I think a lot of people are trying to do their very best, and there's not a great deal of money around. And everybody wants it spent in their particular area. I think if we take a step back and say, right, what is the best for the people in this situation at the moment to stop them falling further? We want to prevent mass homelessness. That's what we want to do with the big issue. We don't want another generation of people having to sell the big issue, although I fear there's going to be a few coming down the line. If we can do our part to bring people together to stop that, I think that's the positive and the best thing that we can do.
Paul, thank you. We're a couple of minutes over, but apologies for that. We still got a really good audience out there. So for another couple of minutes, I'm going to give last word in this panel to you, Tressa. And just to note that one of our participants, Craig, has said in a year when disability assistance was going to invest in disabled people in Scotland, and for reasons we've heard, that's being delayed. How can we ensure disabled people are not left behind with lower incomes, higher costs?
Thanks, Jim. First of all, I would say that disabled people need vital services, so they need access, and I'll come to the disability assistance thing, but they do need access to food and welfare rights. We've provided food to over 2,500 people, and it's not work that we ever envisaged doing or wanted to do, but it's needed to be done because they've slipped through the net. People need digital connections and coaching and access to broadband. People need wellbeing supports. These are all things we've added, services that we didn't ever run before, only over the last 6 months. But coming to, I think something that's really important, it's been touched on today by all the brilliant anti-poverty activists, the importance of participation, the importance of embedding lived experience in all co-design or design of policies that are actually going to affect people. People need to be involved in that. Coming to the issue of social security, we really welcome all the things that have been done in social security, and the approach being taken in Scotland has been fantastic. The promise of £500 support for self-isolation that the Cabinet Secretary mentioned, absolutely welcome that. The £20 uplift to universal credit, I totally agree with Susan, that needs to be continued, but it also needs to be extended to those receiving legacy benefits. And in relation to disability assistance, I think there's a brilliant opportunity here to actually do something to improve the lives of disabled people in Scotland. So I think rather than just focusing on safe and secure, if we could now look to improve that benefit and actually take into consideration if a disabled person's getting PIP or DLA and they're getting social care, they'll be paying significant charges towards their care, meaning that they don't even have the money that the UK government says that they need to live on. So disabled people are always living in poverty, and I think that that needs to be looked at. We really want to see that benefit being increased, and I think if we could have the £20 uplift extended to those on legacy benefits, that would be fantastic and make changes.
Tressa, thank you so much. That concludes our brilliant group of panelists, and your insights, as ever, too brief, but we really appreciate you giving us the benefit of your time and thoughts and sharing your experiences over this period and giving us ideas for where we should go next, which GRF will definitely want to get behind as a partner, and we're definitely open to building more and better solutions. We had the Finance Secretary give some hints about the draft budget this year, so that's one staging post along the way. I just want to, for 1 minute of your time, say a very huge thank you. So the biggest digital clap you can imagine to all of you who've spoken today, and thank you so much for joining us. I want to read out one question or one comment actually that comes from Terry McTernan on the chat. Terry has been producing lots of questions. I've only got through a couple of them, but just some words to kind of finish with, which I think are very appropriate. COVID has allowed us to tackle poverty in ways we never thought possible before. Let us embrace this new way of working, as it has proved to be wider reaching and more effective, while also being economical. Let us continue our newfound ways of working, which may be uncomfortable for some of us, but will have long-lasting results. This is a really good way to sum up what the Cabinet Secretary said about banking and building on the cross-sector working, the pausing and ditching of bureaucracy, the agility that's had to be there. Let's not lose that as we build in our actions to get Scotland back on course to tackling poverty. It only remains for me to say thank you to my colleagues, Eleanor Boyle, who's in the Zoom back room, Rachel Berry, Emma Wincup, who chaired the advisory group with our lived experience participants. Thank you, Emma, for your thoughtful stewardship of that process. Thank you to Deborah Hay, my colleague in the Scotland team. We are a small but growing team in Scotland, and we've been pleased to help present the report today and to present this webinar to you. Please continue to follow hashtag Challenge Poverty this week. Follow our partners at Poverty Alliance. Please stay safe and stay well, and let's be committed still to tackling poverty in Scotland. Thank you very much to all of you.